Okay, good evening to everybody. At this round table that is co-organized as part of the ECREA in collaboration with the Peace Institute, which is a local NGO and research institute that also works on media, and together with Slovenian Communication Association. A warm welcome to everyone and to my guests this evening. Professor Sabina Mihelj, Václav Štětka, and Professor Péter Bajomi-Lázár. The occasion of this roundtable is the launch of the book that is here in front of you, The Illiberal Public Sphere, with the subtitle Media in Polarized Society by Sabina and Václav. And their work aligns well with Péter's work, so this is the formal setting. Professor Sabina Mihelj is from Loughborough University. She works on media theory communication in relation to nationalism. Your research explores the media shaping of collective identities, often in post-socialist context. You have also worked on several comparative studies, media and memory, cross-cultural studies on media consumption and political communication. That is also part of this book. Dr. Václav Štětka is from Loughborough University, where he works as a senior researcher in the fields of political communication, digital media, and the role of journalism. His research addresses issues like media ownership, political parallelism, the rise of illiberalism in Central Eastern Europe. You have researched, Václav, the impact of social media also on politics, and examining also the power dynamics between traditional media and digital platforms. And Professor Péter Bajomi-Lázár from Budapest Business University, known for his research on media freedom, journalism, and political communication in Central Eastern Europe, often also including and reflecting on Hungary as a trendsetter of illiberalism and democracy backlash. His work focuses on media regulation, the role of press freedom, the challenges posed by the government influence on media systems. Okay, so to start the round table, let me just briefly reflect the ideas of the book that argue that we are witnessing increasingly how media systems across European countries, with the focus on CE countries, are co-shaping societal and political polarization, and how they're also becoming instrumental in the expansion of exclusionary, nationalist, authoritarian, populist politics, ultimately also contributing to the normalization of these politics. Thus, at the heart of today's roundtable are some of the pressing issues related to responsibility of the media. How do public broadcasters, social media, disinformation networks co-shape polarized society? And most importantly, which is also part of the title of this roundtable, how can media systems work as a counter-trendsetter? So how can they be reformed, reframed to embrace public concern, public interest, and democratic values? I will start with Sabina, with you. In the last decade, a growing body of literature from the field of media and communication has been addressing these trends of polarization using different entry points conceptually. Illiberalism, polarization, populism, authoritarian populism, democracy backlash. So these are the debates over the last 20 years. So I will just, for a warm-up question, maybe pinpoint to the notion of illiberalism, how you would argue fits into these debates of the larger backlash.
Thank you, Mojca. Does this work? Yeah. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming and for organizing this event. So when we started this project, obviously this was already quite a crowded conceptual terrain. But the concept that was most often used to describe the kinds of processes we were interested in was populism in particular. And we found, we quickly realized that this concept doesn't quite stretch as far enough to describe everything we had in mind. So we felt increasingly that populism was just a convenient tool, but it was used too indiscriminately to actually pinpoint what we were interested in. And we felt that the liberalism offered a convenient alternative for three probably key reasons. And we drew here on other researchers' work beyond communication and media that have tried unpacking liberalism. So the first good reason is that illiberalism actually is defined by its paradoxical relationship with liberalism. Yeah, we might be tempted to see illiberalism as a direct, indirect opposition to liberalism, but it's actually not. It really feeds and grows from the internal contradictions of liberalism. It actually relies on liberal institutions, liberal processes, liberal democratic processes to rise to power. Obviously, all liberal actors have relied on elections to appeal to people. And also we find that illiberal actors often use appeals to illiberal values and use them strategically to, for instance, appeals to freedom of speech, to then open doors for hate speech. Yeah, so that was one fundamental reason that made us think of illiberalism as a good alternative to help us get away from this slightly, simplistic black and white conceptual apparatus that we sometimes find with oppositions, democracy and authoritarianism, black and white. So the second reason is that illiberalism can help us think a little bit more holistically than some of the other terms, or it can help us bring other terms together. So we can think both of illiberal practices, institutions, institutional arrangements, as well as of illiberal narratives, cultural phenomena, discourses. So it helps us bring the systemic and the institutional and the cultural together. So that was another good reason. And we felt this was in particular important for the media, because we do have to theorize the media both as an institution and as a cultural power, a purveyor of discourses and values. And the third reason, at least in our conceptualization, illiberalism is very much a disruptive force. So it's not something static. It always seeks to disrupt and change things. And we conceptualize the public sphere as well as a process, as a staged process. So it helps us think about change rather than just systemic oppositions, if that makes sense. So, and we obviously try and unpack this a little bit more in the book. Yeah.
Maybe just a little sub-question on this contradiction that you mentioned at the beginning with populism.
Yeah.
I mean, there are also research on populism that would be closer to the illiberalism debate. For example, the authoritarian populism that looks also at these macro-structural changes. But so you saw some relations with that debate?
True. But we felt that every time this happens, then you have a qualifier with populism. Yeah, it's right-wing populism, it's authoritarian populism, and the trouble is the definitions of populism really often, circle around what is effectively a type of discourse. Yeah, or a style that relies on this opposition between the elite and the people. And even though, some authors have discussed structural changes in relation to that, the concept of populism doesn't quite capture that. And I guess, what was particularly troubling us was this more indiscriminate use of populism, not when people try to define and link populism to right-wing phenomena, for instance, but rather when populism was used to as just a blanket category, and used to describe, phenomena that were across the political spectrum. And what we felt was often happening with that, and unintentionally, was that some of very damaging phenomena, the far right, racism, were sanitized through the use of the label populism and made more palatable. Yeah, and we felt that as academics, we need be a little bit more careful with how we use language.
Okay, thank you. Václav, I will go to stay within the conceptual debates for a while, to the second part of your book title, so the notion of the public sphere, the public sphere, publicness. We know that in critical communication scholarship are related to to public values, to democracy, and with illiberalism. So we could say that public sphere exists as a democratic per se, or it doesn't. If it's illiberal, then are we still talking about a public sphere? So if you can maybe unpack this antagonism.
Yes, thank you, Mojca. I mean, I think you've put your finger on this issue, which is probably kind of counterintuitive in a way for many who have heard about illiberal public sphere for the first time, and they might have been sort of academically socialized into thinking that indeed public sphere is intrinsically connected with a liberal democratic public sphere, with the historical process with which it has evolved, as described famously by Jürgen Habermas. So we are purposefully trying to depart from this model, from this way of thinking established by Habermas. Even though we are obviously following in his footsteps in many ways, but our point of departure is the recognition that there is not a single public sphere, and that the public sphere indeed does not need to be wedded into the idea of liberal democracy or indeed democracy as such. And it's actually, we are not following Habermas or we are not in a dialogue just with Jürgen Habermas here, but we are following in the footsteps of several other scholars who have pushed these kind of concepts which depart from the classical bourgeois liberal public sphere that Jürgen Habermas has coined. People here are probably familiar with Knecht and Kluge and the proletarian public sphere. There have been other concepts coined over the course of the last decades, including the counter-publics, Nancy Fraser, alternative public sphere. But also there have been several interesting conceptualizations going beyond the realm of democracy. I'm thinking here of a book by a Chinese scholar, Lin, on the contentious public sphere, which assumes that there can be a public sphere sort of underneath the official Chinese state-controlled public sphere. So there have been other attempts criticizing, in a way, the kind of single-minded or single-focused concept of Habermas, and we are simply we have to try to stretch for this line of thinking even further, and point to the fact that there can be more types of public sphere present at the same time, and that indeed they are in a state of competition within many countries that we describe in the book and beyond.
Okay, Péter, about 10 years ago, you started to write about the notion of the colonization of the media, party colonization of the media, at the example of Hungary, but also beyond Central Eastern Europe, arguing that what we are witnessing goes beyond the old repertoires of censorship that is also reshaping propaganda that is now with this colonizing from the party becoming a ritual that the parties are performing. And this notion of colonization also involves the use of media resources to sustain party patronage networks, reward those who are loyal to political parties, and to undermine political rivals and to dissent critical voices. So it's been 10 years now since the start of this debate, and we are seeing, not only in Hungary, but across the region, that these authoritarian colonized party politicians are reinventing new mechanisms of this colonization. So how would you reflect the last 10, 15 years of this continuing evolving of colonizing?
Is this working like this? Yes. Well, That's a very good question. I think that media capture theory or the particularization of the media as an approach were perhaps important paradigms 10 years ago, but they don't really work anymore. And I see two reasons for that. The first reason is that, especially when it comes to media capture theory, it has become a kind of a catch-all concept. It's been used to describe many different things: capture of the media by the state, capture of the media by oligarchs, capture of the regulatory bodies, capture of state advertising. It has also been used to describe many different things, like, taking control of the media to manage information, taking control of the media to channel media resources to party clients. So it explains everything and explains nothing at the same time. It's not a very good analytical tool anymore. And I think the other reason for that could be this huge change in communication technology. Because now with the social media platforms, there are many other means that authoritarian political actors can make use of, like digital smear campaigns, influencers, or simply the weaponization of fake news claims. So there has been a change, a paradigm shift in communication technology, which I think has been accompanied by a paradigm shift in communication research, with most of the research focusing on the uses and misuses of digital technology for political purposes. Basically, we are speaking about the political instrumentalization of social media platforms. And the point there, I think, is that the uses and misuses of these digital tools are, well, political actors use them because it allows them to keep up democratic appearances, whereas taking direct or even indirect control of the media is more problematic. The European Union wouldn't necessarily like it, but they can't really say much about these subtle techniques of using social media to manipulate public opinion.
If I come back to the book, what I found interesting, Václav, this would be for you, is your understanding of media illiberalization as a matter of degree. So you argue that it started with some partisan media across, so your country cases are Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Serbia. So you are arguing about the differences and similarities between them. So how it started with the partisan media more at the edge of the media system, and how it slowly became mainstream. So you speak about the hegemony of this illiberalization. And we are seeing similar trends, obviously, beyond these case studies. Slovenia is one example during the previous government. I'm wondering if you can speak about the differences and similarities between these cases. To what an extent this is a regional trend, it goes beyond the region. What have you found in this context?
So first of all, thanks for reminding the audience of the 4 cases that we have studied in the book. Indeed, that's Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Serbia. And we have selected these countries purposefully with the idea in mind that we will find some differences as well as similarities in the extent to which illiberal trends are observed across them. And that turned out to be the case indeed. And following our empirical analysis and findings, we have developed this theoretical model of the processual, one can say a processual model of the illiberal public sphere, which consists of 3 stages. So the first one is the incipient stage, as we call it, and that's one that we actually observe in many other countries, including in the West, where the illiberal public sphere is essentially constrained to the fringes of the political as well as media systems. It's represented by oppositional right-wing, usually right-wing parties and some fringe media outlets, but it does not reach too much into the mainstream, or not at all, at least. Then we have what we call the ascendant stage, and that's the one where mainstream media have already been partially captured by illiberal actors, be it the government, as in case of public service media, or oligarchs and other types of media owners somehow allied, affiliated with the government and political forces. And they already managed to start changing the institutions and the regulatory and legislative framework that regulates the media systems, and that's something that we observe or have observed in Poland in the case of our four cases, at least in the time period when Poland was governed by the Law and Justice Party, which, as you probably know, ended last year. But that does not necessarily, and unfortunately, mean that the illiberal public sphere ended with them. These kind of processes have a very long duration, and they might come back or might stay in the same intensity regardless of the change of the government. And then the final stage that we have identified, we call it hegemonic stage of the illiberal public sphere. And that's the one where the illiberal public sphere dominates almost completely, and the liberal public sphere is retreats in basically the online domain, and the illiberal narratives are completely mainstream. They are not challenged in the public sphere, in the public sector. And the media are mainstream media are mostly controlled by the government. And again, coming back to our four cases, this is something that we have observed in Serbia and also in Hungary, although there might be some differences in opinions whether Hungary fully qualifies to be labeled as hegemonic illiberal public sphere. But that's something that actually I wanted to mention, that these are ideal, typical stages. That means that we rarely find them in their purest form in reality. So it's a scale, obviously, and some countries might fit better onto those three stages than others. Many might be somewhere in between, including, as we argue in the book, the Czech Republic, which displays some tendencies towards the ascendant stage of the liberal public sphere, but it hasn't reached it yet. And I would say mainly because of the strong position of the public service broadcasters, who are still more or less independent and providing a very good public service. But then, one final point on that note, perhaps, these three stages have actually a certain direction which they are heading towards, and they are heading towards authoritarianism. So. In our view, the process does not necessarily end with the hegemonic public sphere, but it, in many cases, might carve the path towards authoritarianism, because essentially we can ask ourselves, why would the illiberal actors and governments want to stop at the stage where they still have some kind of opposition? And that opposition can be, potentially dangerous to them. So if they have the chance, they will go further into the path, into the authoritarian stage.
I will go to the concept of media polarization that is also related to illiberalism, illiberal public sphere, and it is obviously related to several other trends that we're witnessing. From Péter mentioned before, the digitalization trend, platformization, the fragmentation of public opinion, fake news, disinformation, and so on. And in this polarized context, in one of your chapters, you pick up the topic of migration, LGBTQ+, and we could add other topics, for example, reproductive rights now Europe-wide, that seem to be reappearing in these discourses as the main point for these illiberalizing trends. So if you can reflect a bit on these observations, why and how these topics are, picked up, whether there are some differences and between the countries, and how do they tap into this polarizing?
So maybe just a couple of points. Oh, sorry, right. Starting maybe just with a few points about polarization. In the book, what you're trying to do is not just map these three stages in terms of institutional structures, but we try to do what we felt was really missing in the field, which is research on what's happening with audiences and both their habits, but also attitudes, practices, and so on. So we conducted a lot of, we conducted a survey, interviews, media diaries, and built a picture out of that. And one of the processes that we traced then through these three stages was the process of polarization based on our data. And you're right. We picked migration and LGBTQ issues, or rather hostility, obviously, to migration and LGBTQ rights as two polarizing topics that we see in all four of our countries. This doesn't mean that there weren't others, and obviously on a global scale, illiberalism is one of those really with, you could read it as an ideological repertoire, which can be adapted. It's malleable. It can be adapted depending on context, political environment, period, and so on. So environmental climate change is another one that pops up quite a lot, but we haven't explored. Now, you're right that, anti-immigration and anti-LGBTQ, but maybe in particular immigration seems to be popping up again and again, to the point that we maybe feel as if it was always there. It's one of those, age-old things. It links with racism. It has a long history. But when we went back for this particular chapter to try and reconstruct the changes and the role of both politicians, political elites, but also the church, civil society, and media in the process of polarization and the rise of the liberal public sphere, what became very obvious was that this is a very recent rise. Yeah. So if you go to the 90s, immigration was a non-issue in these countries. Yeah. It really was a matter of specific political actors, but also cultural actors. In Poland, it was the Catholic Church, infamously, that started sending letters, literally during the elections to the electorate, inviting people to vote for those that will protect the rights of the traditional family, and so on and so on. So there were very particular activities designed to actually tap into existing anxieties and fears and a sense of dissatisfaction. And these politicians and other actors offered a kind of language to make sense of what was happening. Yeah, so we can have a debate separately, where these kind of fears and a sense of dissatisfaction that politicians stepped into came from. Yeah, it's a big discussion that we don't deal with in the book. Yeah, some people would argue it has to do with neoliberalism. Others, have other arguments. I think that's not for us to solve. That's as media scholars. But both immigration and LGBTQ and this kind of homophobia and racism offered a kind of language to make sense of these things. Yeah. And politicians very skillfully exploit these fears to actually as a means to mobilize the electorate, to polarize it. And you can literally trace both the parallel rise of anti-immigration sentiments and the rise of illiberal actors first in the parliament and then eventually in positions of power. And then once they were in power, the trick is obviously, especially once they use their position of power to extend their control over the media, it became very difficult to change, and to challenge these discourses and revert things back. To the extent that my sense is for instance, in Serbia, these discourses are so dominant that even if the elite sometimes tries to change them, to please the EU, for instance, it becomes difficult, because then you have a push from the bottom up, because it's so mainstream, it's so widespread, that you can no longer change it. Yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic between the top-down and bottom-up illiberalism as well. yeah, I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but do follow up if I didn't.
It will be sure to switch. Yeah, I will have one. We will come back to this maybe in the debate or later. Péter, the obvious Hungarian case, I have to ask you about that. So legal changes, media law has been changed significantly. Regulatory bodies have been practically abolished in Hungary. Media have been concentrated under the ownership of Kezma, which has been launched 6 years ago and has united pro-government media under a single entity and so on. So we are seeing Orban has been producing like a code book. We are seeing that it is being used in other countries. Both Janša and Orban speak of media wars. So what are the implications of these hard authoritarian line in Hungarian context for the region? How would we reflect on that?
Well, this is one of the issues, I think, where we had this difference of views with Václav. I really loved reading the book. It's the illiberal public sphere is a very powerful conceptual tool to explain these dynamic changes going on in the region. But speaking of Hungary, I do not really think it's in the hegemonic state yet, perhaps. And the reason, and I think that is one of the weaknesses of this concept, because it focuses on media that have been taken by the incumbent governments while losing sight of the rest of the media. Also, there's this question of where are the boundaries of the illiberal versus the liberal public spheres. I mean, are we calculating in terms of the number of titles or of audience reach or of market share? You would get very different results if you would use different calculation methods. Also, are we speaking about a kind of a political cleavage dividing public opinion and public attitude alongside the two spheres, or are we speaking about an ideological cleavage? Because one of the interesting things that this book reveals is that in Hungary, even opposition voters tend to have illiberal attitudes, ultra-conservative attitudes, if you like. So maybe the political and the ideological cleavages are just not the same, but they are cross-cutting. Also, I think it could make sense to argue that in Hungary there are actually two media systems with two different journalism cultures. There is the state media, that's the liberal public sphere, if you like, but there also is some market media, which is not funded by state advertising, which is independent of which hasn't been touched by this nomenclatura appointment system. Also, you have two journalism cultures in terms like there is this collaborative journalism in the liberal public sphere, but at the same time you also have some monitorial journalism. Some things have happened since this book was completed. Like, for example, the President of the Republic was removed from office. I mean, she resigned after some of the independent press revealed that she had pardoned some quite controversial people. Also, this last year has seen the rise of a major challenger to Viktor Orban, a Péter Magyar, who was completely unknown about a year ago. And that is owing to free media and also to social media, which might also remind us that social media are a double-edged sword, because it can be used, as the book actually points out, by opposition forces as a center for resistance, as a vector for resistance. I think that's the term that you are using. So I think it goes both ways, and And the advent of the illiberal public sphere doesn't seem to be an irreversible process. I think that's one of the important things to be remembered.
Yeah, maybe it's a good point now for you to react on that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Peter. We are certainly open to criticism and feedback, constructive critical feedback on our model. And I take a point that from your perspective, maybe Hungary is not fully yet in the hegemonic phase, and it depends on what kind of indicators we choose to make that assessment. And I just have to point out that this is a qualitative assessment. We don't have exact quantitative indicators to say that from this point on the scale it's a hegemonic phase and before it's an ascendant one. It's a fluid model, but I just think that when it comes to the intersections and differences between the political level and the ideological or political cleavages and the ideological cleavages which you mentioned, I think that Hungary is really an interesting case there, because indeed we have found out from the surveys actually that when it comes to people's political and cultural attitudes, Hungary is quite, I mean, the graph is quite skewed towards the right. It's not a normal distribution in other words, and even people who consume liberal media outlets, or at least those who combine them occasionally with conservative, but mostly predominantly consume news from liberal oriented outlets, their attitudes are still rather conservative. So that illustrates the fact that there is a sort of a deep-seated conservatism in the Hungarian society, which is probably difficult to change, even with despite the fact that, as you say, there are still several or some liberal-minded independent media operating on the market. I would say they're mostly operating again in the online domain. There's not that many mainstream media outlets, perhaps, compared to the amount of outlets that are directly or indirectly under Fidesz control. But irrespective of that, when it comes to people's attitudes, they are rather oriented towards the right, towards the illiberal side of the scale, and that just for us indicates that the illiberal public sphere is strongly embedded within the Hungarian culture. And even if, of course, and I wish for the opposition to succeed and to dethrone Fidesz after how many 14 years now in power, seems like an impossible task. But even if it happens, there's no guarantee that these changes will last. And we have seen it in some countries, and I'm afraid that we are about to see it in the Czech Republic, where I come from, where we have voters have gotten rid of the populist government of Andrej Babiš, who also displayed some tendencies towards illiberalism, but only for him to be on the way back just about a year from now. So these things are not guaranteed. I mean, the reversal of the process of illiberalization is not guaranteed with just the removal of the illiberal government.
Okay, I will have now our last round of questions. So far we have mainly discussed media as enablers of illiberal public sphere, but what about the resistance side? So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in Slovenia, if I think of the COVID government, Janša's government during COVID, we have seen, as Péter, you pointed out, apart from the monitorial role, journalists also performing the critical role. And we are seeing that in Hungary with some outlets, those that are allowed to work. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on the way out of the spiral of, as you put it, of this illiberalism? Difficult.
Well, I'll just say a few sentences and then Václav actually wrote that part of the piece where we discussed this specifically that. But they can obviously media act also as vectors of resistance, both social media, so not only social media but also mainstream media. Yeah, I guess the trouble is that there's so little research on this, interestingly, that we don't know what works, and we don't have much evidence of the effects of the strategies that the media are using, or journalists, for instance, are using to resist the trends. Yeah, but I'll hand over to Václav for some concrete examples. Perhaps,
it's a difficult question because but I think it also reminds us that we need to be more nuanced in the answer to that, and going back to the stages of the illiberal public sphere, because the answer will largely depend on which stage of the illiberal public sphere we're talking about. Because it's a completely different matter to suggest some solutions or some, point to some examples of good journalistic practice when we're talking about a relatively healthy democracy, or democracy where the illiberal public sphere is still in the incipient stage. Compared to the situation as we observe in Hungary or Serbia, where most mainstream media and especially public service media are tightly controlled, the whole regulatory environment has been designed by Fidesz to basically serve their political needs. So but I would probably say that one of the key battlefields in this process is really the independence of public service media, and that refers to the countries with the incipient or maybe ascendant illiberal public sphere. So wherever the public service media are still relatively independent, because as I believe we have demonstrated in the book, the role of the public service media is really crucial to prevent from the spiral of polarization to just go beyond the point where it can be stopped, essentially. And in the countries where there isn't any independent public service broadcaster, the whole center of the media landscape quickly disappears. The political ideological center quickly disappears, and taking with it also commercial media, because once there is no strong independent journalistic outlet left, then the values that underpin the notions of journalistic professionalism are also gone with it, and people get used to partisan media serving their opinions and pre-existing attitudes, rather than challenging them, or rather than reminding them that there is something actually that the journalists should observe in terms of being impartial. There are more reasons why to protect the independence of public service media, of course, but this is one of them, in our opinion, to stop or to prevent from the circle of polarization to go beyond control, essentially.
I think that this book of yours is a very powerful argument for media effects, because you're basically suggesting that the more advanced the liberal media sphere or public sphere, the more illiberal the population will be. And I fully agree with that. But I also think that propaganda has its limits, especially in these highly polarized societies. Just one example from Hungary, as always. There was an opinion poll published like 2 years ago suggesting that the Hungarian society is so divided that Fidesz voters would call independent media propaganda outlets, and opposition voters brainwashed people. And the same goes the other way around. If you ask opposition voters, they would say the same things about Fidesz voters and Fidesz media. So in these polarized societies, propaganda certainly has its limits. And that's, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I think that this is one of the factors that might actually stop the further growth of the illiberal public sphere in these countries.
What about on the level of policies? I mean, media policies. You don't. I mean, it's not the focus of your book, but implicitly, you are addressing these issues. I mean, or you mentioned one, so the restoring of public broadcaster. I mean, if we look at the social media, there are ideas of making algorithms responsible towards the public. So there are ideas in policies that are out there. So maybe, yeah, if you can.
Again, I would distinguish in answering this question between the different stages of the liberal public sphere. So I think in countries with a still relatively independent and democratically controlled regulatory system, there's a number of suggestions how media policies can help prevent from the illiberalism to succeed and progress further, including for the media regulators to pay attention to the question issues of impartiality of broadcast media, which, by the way, as you know, I'm sure, do not apply just for public service broadcasters, but for all broadcasters, essentially, in all European countries. There are other incentives that can be applied to the sphere of online media and social media platforms, in particular, in terms of better regulating and preventing from the spreading of hate speech and misinformation. But for the countries that have already fallen prey to the rule of illiberal actors and whose institutional framework has been essentially captured, I think the EU is the only hope now. And you know probably that in the last couple of years there has been a sort of a legislative storm by the European Union having implemented several policy initiatives, including the Digital Service Act, and especially the Media Freedom Act, the European Media Freedom Act, which is a major path-breaking piece of regulation, which has been adopted just this spring. And we are anxiously awaiting to see how it's going to be implemented, whether it will make any change on the ground. According to, if you read it, it definitely should, because it ticks all the boxes by, demanding that public service media are independent, the regulators are independent, the commercial publishers or other companies need to demonstrate that they have some self-regulatory instruments to ensure their independence, and so on and so on. But of course, the devil is in the detail and in the question of how it will be implemented. And I've already encountered some powerful arguments, sadly, that claim that this is a great legislation for anyone who wants to join the European Union, like to ensure that the accession criteria put a lot of emphasis on questions of media freedom. But for those who are already in, here I'm looking at Hungary, it might be too late. So that's not Hungary. Oh, no, not you're represented here.
Okay, so let's conclude now with not Hungary and open the floor for discussion.
Thank you very much, and I'm really amazed about the book, and I can't wait to read it. I have a question to Sabina. You spoke about the diversity and immigration aspect in your topic. Would you mind to get into more detail about your findings and what was striking and everything?
Let's collect, yeah. Maybe you, yes? And then Barbara. Yeah, over there was first, yeah.
Okay. I want to ask about the journalists that engage in that political illiberal public sphere. They do that because they believe in the ideas, or there is any kind of recruitment, like economic rewardings or something like that?
Okay. One more and then back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very much impressed and shaken as well in some way, coming from Germany, so a country seen as major democracy, but with a very, very, very strong right-wing movement, which is quite successful, especially in Eastern Germany at the moment. I'm wondering if you dare to say that these sort of qualitative model of stages that you put up is as well sort of, let's say, as a strategy, how we can read how right-wing populist parties are going on. So I'm very much in the middle of the struggle about public service broadcasting, and I feel every day how they try to undermine the independence of what, first by attacks, and then we will see what is coming or not coming. So I'm asking a little bit for what we can see, sort not in common, but learn from the experiences that you have. I'm concerned about what is going on in Germany, to be honest.
So back to you now, maybe. Who wants to? Should I start maybe with the migration one? So I'll just isolate maybe two couple of points from the chapter. The first one that I found personally really fascinating when we look at the survey data was the extent to which different dimensions of illiberalism don't go hand in hand. And migration was such a perfect example because anti-immigration attitudes were highest in the Czech Republic, which was at the same time most liberal by far in relation to LGBTQ. And I think that was one of the bases in which we developed then this argument about illiberalism as a repertoire. So it's not directly related to immigration, but just gives you a sense of how these dimensions can paradoxically really not go together, even though we might logically think they do. Another interesting observation from the more kind of historical overview of the evolution of these attitudes and topics and the behavior of elites, for me personally, again, was the extent of transnational learning and copying across countries. So to give you an example of immigration, the key turning point was the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, and you could literally trace. Hungary started first, developed a strategy with Orban, then Poland went second, and Czech Republic third, I believe, and it was pretty much a direct copying almost of arguments and so on. And then the LGBTQ, it was a slightly different process, but Poland was the starting point, and again there was copying involved transnationally. And this is not a coincidence because these leaders actually who are involved in these movements, they do have transnational networks. They have their own meetings where they meet and discuss and so on, and which go well beyond Eastern Europe. So one of the events I was just taking as a case study is the Budimpešti I can't remember, demographic forum, where Orban happily hosts, several right-wing, far-right actors from across the world, from the US to Australia to the Middle East, and the latest one, I think Giorgia Meloni was also a honorary guest there. So the transnational dynamic, and maybe the third point would be just the critical importance when we looked at the role of the media. The critical importance, again, of public service media as a bulwark against the further spreading of these attitudes. And this is not something we show in the book, but as a spin-off article, we did a study looking specifically at the Czech Republic, where we were actually able to show that public service media were really critical in preventing the further spreading of anti-immigration attitudes in the country. So I'll which links to the question now on public service media.
Yeah, probably. Just to complement what Sabina was saying, we actually did manage to show by longitudinal data that the exposure to the Czech public service media led to a slight decline of anti-immigrant attitudes by the viewers. So there's some hope, but. Following from there to the question on Germany, which you asked about, right? I'm not an expert, obviously, on German political or media system, but I do follow what's going on, and especially in light of the recent election that took place in Germany. I think that Germany is safely still in the incipient stage of the illiberal public sphere. So far, the illiberal actors have not risen to power, but obviously we hope that this book might provide a conceptual tool for analyzing the extent to which these actors are attempting to spread and capture a greater share of the public sphere. And obviously it's also a memento showing what happens and how quickly things can change if democracies are not cautious enough and not on their guard. And as we just discussed, there are institutions that are in peril right now, and there's a battle around their independence and quality. And I think that the examples from Poland or Hungary indeed make it quite clear that if these institutions are not protected by means of regulation, but also by means of public support, then they become an easy prey to these powers.
If I may react to the question on what drives collaborative journalists, I don't know the answer, and the reason for that is when we try to interview journalists of the illiberal public sphere, collaborative journalists, if you like, they simply wouldn't respond to our interview requests. And in fact, the funny thing there is that we actually know a lot more about how the communist media system used to work under János Kádár and other leaders than we know about the current media system under Orban and his associates. So we can only guess that some people do that because of existential pressures, or maybe they are being blackmailed. Other people do it out of honest conviction. I think it's you might possibly find very diverse drives, motives behind those people.
Okay, over there.
So you don't accidentally choke anyone with this cord. Hi. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very, very interesting, very inspiring. My question pertains to the analytical applicability, if you will, of the concept. I'm from Belgium, which I would argue that if you would analyze it, or if it would have been included in the book, it would be on the low end of the incipient stage. But of course, we have some actors that if it would be up to them, that they would, of course, roll back certain acquired rights or install certain procedures, etc., which we then could analyze. And when it comes to, for example, populism or authoritarianism, which are concepts which are kind of contrasted with this illiberal public sphere, they translate more easily to certain strategies, or you can speak of certain populist rhetoric, for example, without speaking of populists. You can identify authoritarian strategies or media or policies in non-strictly speaking authoritarian actors. How do I, in other words, interpret this concept if I want to apply it, for example, in analyzing certain actors nowadays, which are not necessarily illiberal, in that definition?
Is it okay if I ask each speaker a question? So I'll start with Péter. When you mentioned at the beginning that media capture is no longer an optimal term, would you say that this is the case in point of what we're witnessing in Slovakia right now, where the key ruling party, the Smer party of Robert Fico, is not as dominant as Fidesz is, but it is still remarkably successful, I would say. It's recently restructured the public broadcaster. In parallel, their largest commercial television station has reduced news reporting. There have been staff changes of prominent reporters in both institutions. Or would you say that this would still be relevant to the term media capture? And then quickly, if I move to Václav, just like when you commented on Germany, would you be willing to comment on where in the three stages you've described, is Slovakia right now after 1 year of the rule of the right-left coalition of Robert Fico? And the third question to Sabina, when you've mentioned the overspilling of the rhetoric, the copy-pasting between Poland, Hungary and Czechia, do you expect that if the course of events is, as Václav indicated, and as everything indicates to that, Andrej Babiš returns to power in Czechia, would you expect that these changes, these sort of resurgences of the liberal actors in Slovakia and Czechia, will that also boost Janez Janša and SDS in the upcoming elections in Slovenia? Will it help him rhetorically in his campaign? Thank you.
Where should we start? Okay, maybe with the first question about where to draw the line. I mean, I should clarify when we. When I was talking earlier about the benefits of using illiberalism, I wasn't trying to suggest that we should just ditch populism. We should just define it a bit more narrowly, and in a way define it in a way communication and media scholars have already started defining it as a particular political discourse style, and leave it at that. So I think you can safely use it in that way. But when it comes to describing, say, changes in attitudes, in norms, in narratives, or in institutions, populism will not get you far. Yeah, you will need illiberalism, I would suggest, to capture that. And just briefly in response to the question directly to me, I think if it goes that way, I mean, I'm sure Janša will have material to work with. So, and I believe, although I have to admit, living in the UK for over 20 years now, I'm not following the Slovenian situation quite as closely, so maybe Mojca might be better placed to comment, but I understand that the current political situation isn't quite as rosy as you would perhaps want it to be, and there's quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the current government, a lot of ministerial changes, which is obviously not good news for the next round of elections. But there's always possibilities for resistance and reversal, and I think there's there should be some work done in that direction.
Just a quick response on the situation in Slovakia and where is it heading. So as many other people, I've been watching with a sense of shock and horror the rise of illiberalism in Slovakia ever since the election last year, which brought Robert Fico back in power. And I would say that the process of the expansion of the illiberal public sphere is unprecedented. It's far faster and more intense than what we have observed in our four countries. I would say what we are seeing in Slovakia right now is the illiberal public sphere on steroids. Just for your for the information of probably most of audience members here, only yesterday a member of a Slovak parliament was expelled from the House of Commons for having a sticker on her laptop which was identified as LGBT propaganda. So, and she refused to take it down, which she was asked to, and she was escorted out of the room, which I mean, it's unheard of. And these, unfortunately, kind of practices are becoming ever more commonplace and ever more, normalized. And this is very dangerous path. And I feel like you ask me where I would place Slovakia. Well, I don't have all the data available, but intuitively, I believe that we are seeing a well-advanced liberal public sphere stage and heading very quickly towards the hegemonic one. If some miracles won't prevent from this trajectory.
There was this question about whether the concept of media capture can be applied to Slovakia or not. I still think that it's a useful concept because it's basically establishing a link between the political system and the media system and tells you how political capital is translated into media capital and then media capital is translated back into political capital. So it's still a useful concept, only that it doesn't explain some of the latest phenomena. There's this wonderful book called Spin Dictators, which describes how the authoritarian leaders today use media tools, including new digital media tools, to change public opinion without being caught in the process, without being accused of intervening with press freedom by international media watch organizations or the European Union. So the theory of media capture doesn't really capture that process.
So thank you so much for a very inspiring and very important discussion, and thank you for the book. I mean, I totally agree on the relevance of the analytical categories, etc. But sorry for asking a question that perhaps go a bit beyond the book and the analysis, but I take the opportunity with this panel to ask this question. I mean, now we discuss the relevance and the dynamics in the media, etc. But do you have any reflections on why does this happen at this moment of time in history? I know it's a tough question, but I would like to hear some reflections on that. I mean, why does those authoritarian values and illiberalism being kind of developing and activated at this particular time in history? Could you give some? I mean, of course, it depends on the context, the country, etc. I know that, but can you have any reflections on that?
Okay, thank you for the discussion. What was said during it is that there was a notion that when illiberal actors achieve hegemonic state, they probably won't stop and go authoritarian model, which probably would mean censorship, a serious limitation to freedom of speech. But given the fact that the countries like Poland, Czech Republic or Slovakia are members of European Union, I'm just wondering how plausible is that notion. The first reason are possible sanctions, so those illiberal actors can weigh pros and cons and decide not to do it. And the second is the something I would call irresistible charm of illiberalism for political actors, which means that it keeps the facade of democracy, and in that sense it provides a legitimation for their rule. So to conclude, I can't really imagine the emergence of authoritarian public sphere in European Union, and please convince me that I am wrong.
Hi, my name is Peter. Thanks for an interesting presentation. Maybe my question would be connected to the first one of the colleague back there. For example, is your model of illiberal public sphere like universally applicable, or is it more historical? To put it another way, is a model applicable globally, or only to societies that have something in common historically? For example, capitalism, some liberal values, and so on. For example, for mapping, how would you then, maybe that could be a good starting point. We have authoritarian regimes that came to power with, I don't know, army. There was no liberal values around. Cannot say about illiberalism, or maybe, well, I mean, everything is forbidden there almost. So, yeah. Thanks.
Oh, that wasn't me. Hello, hi. Thank you for your wonderful presentation of the book. I'm Dutch, so all of a sudden I have to think where my country is on this spectrum since a few months. So I'm rather bitter with that development in my own country. But I'm also a little bit bitter on the role that actually media and universities have played in this process. They seem not as adamant as I would like them to be to defend themselves, so to speak. So when you say we should, as a public, I think you mean cherish these institutions, make them stronger through legislation. What is the role you see for media and, I guess, universities themselves? How, because it seems to prescribe also that they should play a certain role against illiberalism. Right? Thank you.
Find the questions, yeah.
Where to start? There was a question, I think the first one was regarding the sort of historical conditionality of the trends and tendencies we observe, right? So you ask a question, why do we observe these tendencies right now? In my answer, and it's a bit dark one, I would reverse the optics, just for provocation. Why did we observe the rise of democracy in the region in the particular time? So 20, 30 years ago. Was it not a historical coincidence back then that the stars aligned and democracy was allowed to flourish? But we need to bear in mind that most of these countries we're talking about, at least in our book and in the broad region, they have had very shallow democratic tradition. They have not had much experience with democracy. Some of them not at all. Prior to 1990s. And so the part of the answer that I'm thinking about to this question is that these tendencies have somehow always been there. We're talking about longue durée historical processes. We're talking about cultural background for the type of politics that we are seeing as being, again, very popular. But it has always been popular, just not visible. And for a moment, it was exchanged, or people have fallen in love with democracy. But maybe that's not the default state of this of these countries. Well, it's a dark answer. I agree. I confess that, but it's one that we should bear in mind when trying to push in defense of liberal democracy, which I still think we should. But we are up against probably much deeper and stronger enemies than we might think.
Yeah, maybe if I can add a few thoughts very speculatively. I think I don't disagree with Václav, but I think there's also something to be said about the exhaustion or the decline in the appeal of traditional narratives of progress, and our inabilities as societies to accept that we can't always live better and better and better. And I think what, to me, liberalism offers a way out, by kind of harking partly to the past, and to this vision of society that was better and had this sense of maybe being able to still get better, and I think we just have to grapple with that as society, that maybe we are at a point where, life will not always be getting better. Also in material terms, and we have to just accept that, that our children will not live a better life than we do, and that if we embrace liberalism, we're gonna just make things worse, and we have to try and protect what we have, so maybe a little bit less pessimistic than Václav as well in terms of historical legacies of the. Or at least I would say, if you think that it's partly to do with the relative young age of democracies in Eastern Europe, where we see this happening more pronouncedly, I would say, well, Europe doesn't have exactly a brilliant and long and illustrious history of democracy either. Yeah, so nobody's immune. Let's put it that way. And just a quick answer in relation to the applicability of the model. I mean, it is applicable elsewhere, but I think to countries that have reached at least some form of at least semi-democracy. Yeah, and I think already the case of Serbia is interesting in our model because it was never a fully established liberal democracy. Yeah, but it still applies, I think, the model to some extent, but not obviously to countries where there was not even an element of democratization. Yeah, if that makes sense.
The question about whether it is possible at all for an EU member state to fall down the ladder and end up being authoritarian. So I agree with you that it seems impossible, and maybe that's the reason why Orbán specifically hasn't gone full-blown authoritarian yet, because he knows he would be risking EU membership if he did that, and there's obvious incentives, I mean very material incentives for him to stay in the European Union. But we will see. There are other powers that are pushing Hungary and other countries out of the EU and empowering the illiberal actors and leaders. And it's not guaranteed that these countries, especially Hungary, will remain an EU member forever. But yeah, I agree broadly with the logic behind your question, as I understand it, that the only thing that probably prevents from the illiberal public sphere to descend further down into the full authoritarian mode in these countries is the EU membership. But there are things which will put this to a test very, very soon.
Thank you to everyone, to the panelists and to the audience. So we are closing this roundtable and the formal part and continue with the informal chat.